Welcome to another lesson. This is Unmesh again. I hope you're having a great time delving into the depths of compositing. Speaking of compositing, one of the most important aspects or elements in compositing is shadows. Without shadows, your compositing just wouldn't look that convincing or convincing at all. Think of it like this. Let's say you have a subject standing on the ground and just over the subject there is a spotlight. But if you look at the ground, there is no shadow. Well, unless you want to make a horror movie or a really bad Photoshop, creating shadows are essential. Because if there's a light, there would be a shadow. We learned how to match the lights and the colors, but to have the light, we have to have the shadows, and we have to have the shadows with the new surrounding or the new environment where we add the new element. Make sense? So in this lesson, we're going to learn 3 ways to create shadows in Photoshop. The first one is pretty obvious, and that is we're just going to extract the old shadow of the original element. The second one is using drop shadow, but in a different, interesting way. And the third one is manually painting the shadows. All of these ways are actually very interesting, and you'll have a lot of fun learning how to do this. So without any further ado, let's get started with the very first example. So in this first example, we have a subject, as you can see, and she has a pronounced shadow. Now this technique, the first technique, will only work if you have the shadow very clearly shown. What does that mean? Well, right now she has a shadow and there are no bumps and ups and downs or disturbances in the wall where the shadow is falling. So we can actually use this shadow. If the background was a lot textured, if there was a lot going on in the background, and let's say there was a stone background with a lot of ups and downs and bumps and crevices, then it would be very hard for us to use and extract this shadow. Even in the ground, the shadow is pretty clean. I know there are some textures in there, but that's okay. We can neglect that. And this is the background, the new background that we're going to be using. Let's open them up in Photoshop. So I'm just going to drag it and drop it into Photoshop right over there. We have the background in place. On top of that, let's just drag and drop the subject. Let's drag it and drop it right there. First of all, let's adjust the subject. I think her size is relatively all right. So let's keep her in line. Now, once you have done that, we have to make a layer for the shadow and one layer for the subject. So let's make 2 copies of it. We already have one. Press Ctrl or Command J to make one more. Firstly, let's just double click here, and this is for the shadow. So let's name it shadow, and this will be the subject. So double click on the text and name it subject. Okay, let's turn off the shadow for now. Now with the subject layer, let's select the quick selection tool, the object selection tool, or the magic wand tool, any of these 3 tools, and at the top you will see select subject. Now just to make sure that Photoshop does not accidentally take in some of the background, and it won't, because if you have the subject layer selected, it probably won't. Just turn off the background layer. All right, select the subject layer and then click on select subject. Photoshop does a pretty good job of selecting the subject. Now if you want, you can go in and refine the selections and make sure that you have a proper selection of the hair and just erase the extras from here. You can take all the time in the world to do that, and we have discussed a lot of selection methods before. Okay, so you can refer those previous lessons as well. But in this case, I'm just going to subtract this area using the quick selection tool. Probably add this shoelace back up. It's fine. If you zoom out, you won't be able to tell. I'm just being lazy here. You take your time. All right. Once the selection is in place, just click on the mask button. We have the subject. Now let's turn on the background. But where is the shadow? Let's turn on the shadow. Now we might have learned a little bit about blend modes before. The important blend modes. Remember the very first lessons? We learned about multiply. Now multiply is a blend mode which darkens. So let's change the blend mode of the shadow from normal to multiply. Now we have the shadows all right, but we have a lot of other places. So let's just mask out only the shadow. So you don't have to be very accurate here. Select the lasso tool and just have a rough selection around the shadow area. This particular area, all right? Okay. And then click on the mask button. You still see a lot. Now if you're wondering, how is the selection edge so smooth? Well, my feather was increased. So right now, have a look. I had a feather of 15. If the feather would be 0, there would be no softness. And as you increase the feather, it adds softness to the selection. We don't really need that. I had it on for my previous project, but just keep in mind that you change your settings back to normal after you do any other project. Anyway, so once you have that selection in place, click on the mask button. This is something you should see. Now, we don't want to bring in any of the color from the shadow's background. Okay, we don't want to bring in this blue, we don't want to bring in this brown. So we have to take that color away. For that, we create a hue saturation adjustment layer. But right now, if I play with it, it also takes away the saturation of the new background. We don't want that to happen. So what do we have to do? We have learned this before. We have to create a clipping mask. We have to limit this hue saturation adjustment layer to just the shadow layer. And the way to do that is you click on this button. You see this arrow right there? It means it's limited to the shadow. Also, one other way is holding the Alt key or the Option key and clicking on the line between these two layers. And now you can just take away the saturation. All right. Now that the saturation is, gone, we can take away these extra areas by creating another curves adjustment layer. Click on the adjustment layer icon and then choose curves, and also limit it just to the shadows, and just make these areas even brighter. If it's absolutely white, it'll automatically be hidden. Why? Because multiply is a blend mode which makes things darker, but it also is a blend mode which hides everything that is 100% white and shows everything that is 100% black. So let's try to make it 100% white by taking the slider on the right to the left. And just when these lines go away, we have to stop. All right. Don't go too excessive on this one because the shadows will be too hard and some weird things are going to show up. Now there are still lines here, so we can go a little further, but not too much. This is all right. Now there are certain things which we need to clear up right there. Don't worry about it. Now let's come back to the mask of the shadow. Take the brush, take a soft round brush, and with black as the foreground color, just erase these extras. Make sure the flow and opacity are at 100. Just erase these extras. Nothing complicated here. And erase these extra lines over here. And it's gone. So simple. Let me make the brush a little larger. Make the edges a little softer. And there you have it, my friend, a realistic shadow. Now, the subject isn't still matching that well with that of the background. What do we do now? Well, we can try making the shadows a little darker, or we can also try adjusting the background. Let's do it one by one. First of all, let's add a little spotlight in the background. So first, let's create a curves adjustment layer. All right. And now we're going to take it up just like this. Okay. Just make sure that it just matches with that of the subject. Okay, this works for me if you ask me. Then you select the mask of the curves, press Ctrl or Command I. Then you take the brush with a hard round brush, not pressure size, with a regular hard round brush. You can actually make sure the flow and opacity are at 100. With white as the foreground color, just dab right over here. Now you can take the brush, Now you can press Ctrl or Command T for transform. And right click on it and then choose distort. You can just shape it in whatever way you want. So I'm just going to shape it in the shape of a spotlight like this, probably something interesting. This works for me. Okay. Now, once you have done that, you go to the mask properties. If I double click here, it takes me to the mask properties. If it doesn't, just single click on the mask and then go to window and make sure properties is checked. All right. Or even if you are in the curves properties, you click on the mask icon right there, it takes you to mask properties. But for that, you have to select the mask. Now you can simply increase the feather. So in my opinion, I think 300 would be a nice number to be at, or probably even 400. Yeah. Now, after you have added feather, you can still just move the spotlight according to your wish. Okay. So I have moved it a little bit. Let's move it up a little more. Now, Since we have added a spotlight, I also want to make the surrounding areas a little darker. So let's make a copy of this curves adjustment layer, press Ctrl or Command J. But in this case, we want to have the opposite mask. So select the mask, press Ctrl or Command I. And again, we do want to do the opposite here. So take the curves down. I'm so sorry about it. Okay, so take this point and bring it down like this. Just like that. Okay. Now we didn't want to apply it on the floor because the light is falling as a spotlight on her, and a little bit light we want on the floor. So let's get in here. Take a brush. You can also paint with a hard round brush because the feather is already increased too much. So now you can take it a little away from the floor. That way it'll look a little more realistic. Okay. That looks all right. Now on top of that, to match it even more, I feel that the shadow should be a little more. So what if we make a group of the shadow layer? So select the shadow, hold the shift key, select the topmost layer of the shadow adjustment, which was the curves. So we have the curves, hue, saturation, and shadow all selected. Press Ctrl or Command G to create a group of that, and then press Ctrl or Command J to make a copy again. Now with that copy, just decrease the opacity and slowly and gradually increase it to a point which feels okay to you, which feels realistic to you. I'm going to keep it at about 25%. On top of that, to make all of it a little more realistic, we're going to add a color lookup table. I suggest you adding something like a candlelight. See how nicely it brings everything together? So let's keep it at 30%. And also let's add one more color lookup table. And this time we can go for something like a 2-strip? No, 3-strip? What do you think? 3-strip does look good. Here's the before, here's the after. See that? Adds a little to the photo. So we can have it as well at about, slowly and gradually increase it to the point where you like it, 45%. Let's add one more. Let's add a color lookup table. In my opinion, color lookup tables are a great way to mix and match things and just bring everything together and just experiment with a combination of color lookup tables in Photoshop. And as I was saying, one of the best ways to just bring the composite together. 3-strip, we have already applied that. Crisp warm, oh my gosh, that is really creating a nice effect. Candlelight, we have done that. Crisp warm is really making it pop. So you can just scroll through and experiment what works for you. And by the way, this scrolling that I'm doing, I found that I can only do it in Windows. Maybe you can do it in Mac, maybe not, I'm not sure. Because with the earlier version of Photoshop, I wasn't able to scroll. And the way I'm doing that is that I'm clicking once here and I'm just scrolling with my mouse. Alright, so I feel that crisp form was really adding a lot to the photo. Let's go for about 50% of that. And there you have a wonderful composite. Let me share with you the before and after. So, okay. So this was the before, this is the background, and this is the subject. Okay, not matching at all. Now if I turn on everything, this is the after. Look at that. Just extracting the original shadow looks so much more realistic. So whenever you have the opportunity to just extract the original shadow, prefer that over painting shadows any day. Now, in which situations can you extract the original shadow? It's simple. The shadow has to be clean. That's it. If the shadow is clean, if the surface that has the shadow doesn't have a lot of texture or disturbing elements, you can clearly extract the shadow. Also, in situations where the shadow doesn't fall on a flat surface and the surface is very up and down or curvy, in that situation as well, you cannot extract the shadow unless the new surface is also curved in the exact same way, which is very rare. So, unless you have a shadow on a flat surface or similar surface, in this case, it was not on a completely flat surface. It's flat here, and then at the bottom we have this ground where the shadow is also there. So we pasted the subject in such a way, in such a new background, where it's the same way. It's not a flat concrete wall. Let's move on to the second technique. Let's save this and let's move on to the second one. Okay, so for the second technique, we have drop shadow. Now, some of you might already know what drop shadow is, just dropping a shadow and creating some nice text effects. We have also worked with drop shadow before, but what if I told you that you can actually separate the drop shadow to create some interesting effects and also get more freedom? That's what we're gonna do with this example. So first of all, let's drag in this new background and let's chop it in Photoshop. And by the way, if you're working with some documents and you want to close the other documents, there's an option in Photoshop to do that. All you have to do is to go to File and then choose Close Others. And it just closed the document that we previously worked with because we had saved it. If we hadn't saved it, it'll give you a warning that you need to save that. Anyway, so you have this new background and I want this man to be standing here. Now remember where the lesson where we learned about perspectives, that we have to match the horizons. So in this case, even if you try to match the horizons, even if you do your best, let's imagine these lines just touching the vanishing point right over there. And even if you do that, it might not always be perfect. As I told you in that lesson, when it comes to matching the horizon and vanishing points, you don't have to take it very seriously because there is a very good possibility that both of those images were taken with different kinds of lenses. For example, let's say if this image was taken with a telephoto lens and this sea beach was taken with a wide angle lens, in that case, it just won't work well. So keep that info in mind. Anyway, let's just place him and turn off the background so that we can just focus on him. And let's click on Select Subject, the way we did with the previous example. Let's turn this back on and then click on the mask button. Now, as you can see, he looks like a giant. Even if he tried to match the horizons, tried to match the vanishing points, he does look like a giant. So we have to kind of guess it right over here. I'm gonna right click over here and then just again choose Convert to Smart Object so that we don't have to deal with that mask. And if we want to deal with that mask, we can always double click right over here. It takes us to another document where we have the mask available. It's still all non-destructive. Anyway, press Ctrl or Command T, place him where you want to place him. So I feel that I want to place him right over here. Okay, and let's make him smaller. So I'm bringing the anchor point down so that when I make him smaller and hold the Alt key, he's gonna stay in the same place. Okay, so this size seems to be just about right. And that's okay. And we can move it left to right and see what works for us. A little bit to the left is all right. Now, there are two options. You can match the color of the background to the subject or subject to the background. We often match the color of the subject to the background, but in this case, we have a black and white subject. So I'm not going to work hard and just recolor the subject again. So let's make the background black and white. One of my favorite ways to create black and white conversions that really create really good contrasty black and whites is just creating a gradient map. Yes, that's right. Now I understand that you can also create a black and white adjustment layer and have a lot of adjustments here, right? But no matter what you do, let me reset that first. This is the default result with black and white adjustment layer. However, let me share this with you. Pretty cool. If we create a gradient map from black to white, it creates a much more fantastic contrasty result. So this is with the black and white adjustment layer and this is with the gradient map. See that? See that smooth contrasty result? I kind of like that. You can do whatever you want. Of course, you can adjust the black and white adjustment layer to make it look like this. But, you know, I just love this because it gives you good results out of the box. Okay. Now I can go here and I can just meddle with these settings. So I can click on one of these sliders and we can take this diamond a little bit to the right or left to just make it darker or brighter and control the balance of blacks and the whites. So I feel that if I move it a little bit to the right, this seems to be all right at about location 62. Okay, now let's create the shadow of this man. How do we do that again? Well, you can simply create a drop shadow. Some of you might say, Unmesh, what are you thinking? Well, I'm thinking right. So double click on the right hand side of the layer. By the way, there's no right or wrong in Photoshop. There are just hundreds of ways. You just have to pick which one works for you and your image. Okay. Let's check drop shadow. Now this is not the kind of shadow we wanted to create. First of all, let's select drop shadow. So you can actually move drop shadow if you already didn't know that. You can move it here and there. Of course, you can just increase the size and change the opacity and all that. But really, this wasn't the shadow we want to create. We don't want to make it look like it's just attached with a spring on top of a flat photo. We don't want that. So here's what we do. We increase the opacity all the way to 100 because we want the ability to adjust this later. And we decrease the size so that's all very accurate and hard edged, so that we can adjust it or blur it to our liking later. Once you're done with this, you can place it anywhere, it just doesn't really matter, and hit OK. Okay. There's also another way of doing that, but then again, I wanted to show you how to separate a drop shadow. So this is a drop shadow as an effect, but what if you want to separate it? Well, you can go to Layer, Layer Style, and then Create Layer. Hit OK. Now you have the drop shadow on another layer. With the drop shadow separated, first of all, let's convert it into a smart object so that no matter stretching and bending that we do, we can change that later, and that too without losing details or causing any damage to the quality. So right click on it and then choose Convert to Smart Object. Press Ctrl or Command D right here. Now it's selecting all of it. So right click on it again and convert it to Smart Object again. Press Ctrl or Command T. Whenever that happens, just convert it to Smart Object again. It'll just limit it to that. Right click on it and then choose Distort. Now you can create a shadow out of this. There you go. Now, of course, what I would suggest is, first of all, let's just bring him in sync with the person and then do it. Let's zoom out a little and bring it down. Bring this point down as well. Just keep it in line with the sun. And I feel this looks about right. Let's zoom in. I know his legs look awkward and they should match. Now you can of course separate this area and try to move it or paint back in. I'm just super lazy, so here's what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna bring it up. I know this is not the right way to do it, but it looks all right. Looks okay to me. So let's just try to hide our mishaps. Okay. Now we see a line here. So how do we fix the line? That's on the subject. So just above the subject layer, let's just name it subject. And this is the shadow. It's actually the drop shadow that we separated. Let's name it shadow. Above the subject, let's create a brand new layer. Hold the Alt key or the Option key and click on the line between these two layers. Now let's take the brush, sample this color, and just paint over this area. Now that gap is filled. Okay. Now, have you ever noticed that if there's a light source right here, and here's a wall, if you put your hand close to the wall, the shadow is very pronounced and the edge of the shadow is very hard, right? As soon as you begin to move away your hand from the wall, the shadow grows to be softer and softer, right? That's what's going to happen here. The shadow that is closer to the subject will be hard, and as it goes more and more further, it'll be softer and softer. In Photoshop's language, it would be more blurrier. Okay. A great way to do that actually is applying the tilt shift blur. So select the shadow layer, go to filter, blur gallery, and then tilt shift. Now we want the blur to start right over here. We already know what tilt shift is. We want the blur to start just right here where the shadow starts. Okay. And we want the blur to gradually grow up until the last point right here. Let's increase the value and see what suits best with this example. Let's choose 150. We can always change these values later and hit OK. And there, my friend, we have our shadow. Now, definitely the shadow is too dark, so let's just lighten it up a bit by decreasing the opacity. Now again, it doesn't get equally lightened. Close to his leg, it would be a little more darker, because right now, have a look. This area looks nice, okay, lightened, but this area just looks too fake, okay? So we need to lighten it in a meticulous way. For that, create a mask for the shadow layer. Take the gradient tool, take a gradient from black to white, and then just create a gradient from right here. just like this. Now, we did just the opposite because the reverse is checked. So make sure reverse is unchecked. Do something like this, but that would be extreme, right? So let's start right here at the very end. And if you hold the shift key, it would be a straight line. Anyway, we don't want it to be a straight line. So till his leg, we'll keep it like this. Again, it's too harsh. So go to the mask properties, select the mask, and just open up the properties by going to window, and then make sure properties is checked. In here, just decrease the density right here. Density is like the opacity of the mask. So at 0 density, it's like we had no mask. Slowly and gradually, let's decrease the density to what feels all right. Whatever gradient that feels all right. To me, if you ask me, I'm going to keep it at about 30-ish. On top of that, you can also decrease the opacity even more at about 80% or 90%. What do you feel about that? Right, 90 looks nice. On top of that, we also add a little more. You can also select the gradient in the mask. Press Ctrl or Command T to adjust it. But before that, you need to unlink the mask. Then press Ctrl or Command T. Then just adjust the gradient to your liking. Let's keep it that way. And there we have our shadow. Now there are still some work to do. If you look at the subject, it has some noise, but the background doesn't have much noise, enough noise to match that of the subject. So just above the background layer, we can create a noise layer. Press Ctrl Shift N, Command Shift N to bring up the new layer dialog box. Change the blend mode to overlay. Check fill with overlay neutral color. Hit OK. Now it is gray. Let's name it grain. Now let's add some noise to it. Go to filter, convert for smart filters, hit OK so that we can change the value of noise later. Let's go to filter, noise, and then add noise. We'll add a similar amount of noise here. Let's go for about 35 is fine, in my opinion, if you ask me. But this noise is very, very sharp. We need to just soften it a bit. Let's go to filter, blur, and then Gaussian blur for the noise. And let's go for 0.4. Okay, about 4 or 0.3. Let's go for 0.4. That's a little more smoother that way. And there we have some noise. Also, the noise is too much. So let's make sure it's not that much. If you look at the sky, it's just too much. So let's decrease the value and set it at about 40%. A little bit of noise is all right. Now, have a look at the sides. These sides are not supposed to be so bright. On the top, it's okay, I understand. But these sides, well, let's darken it. So just above the subject layer, create another layer. Hold the Alt key or the Option key, click on the line between these two so that we also limit that to the subject. Take a brush, black as the foreground color is fine because it's already black and white. We don't have to worry about colors. And now just simply paint with a lower flow. Flow at 1%, we're just darkening these areas. You can also do it with curves, but really this is more effective in this case. Not saying it'll be in all the cases, but in this case it is. Okay, there you go. Let's take a look at the before and after. So here's the before, lights coming in from the sides, not looking that realistic. Also, this side needs to get a little darker. Light on this side is fine. Now that we have matched that, you can also create a curves adjustment layer on top of that to even darken or brighten it. But in this case, in my opinion, if you look at it, it looks all right. Also, what if we add just a little glare to it? It will really bring everything together very well. So let's create a layer at the top. And simple, just sample this color, which is obviously white. With a soft round brush, make it enough larger and just dab right over here. Just to create a glare. Now increase the flow when you do that. Okay. And this is all right. Now the intensity here is too much. Let's decrease the opacity and let's set it to about 40%. And boom, with that glare, it really makes the image. Look at the shadow. It's so magnificent. So that's how you separate the drop shadow and you shape it in any which way you want. Now, there will be cases where you cannot do either of these. So first, we extracted the shadow in this example, as you can see. We had a clean shadow that we could extract. In this example, the subject did not have any complicated movement, plus he was standing flat. So it was easy to create a drop shadow and separate it and shape it the way we want. But in every case, it won't be that simple. Sometimes you will have to paint the shadows. And that brings us to our last example. Let's take a look at that. So here we have a background and let's say I want to place a cup here. So let's just drag that and drop it over it. Now in this case, extracting shadow wouldn't be that easy because there are lots of objects right here, and also at the same time the shadow area is a little textured as well, and it's just not, the shadow is just not looking all right. So first of all, I would just press Ctrl or Command D and flip the image horizontally, because in this case, if you look at the background, I feel that the light is coming a little bit from the left hand side, because if you look at the right hand side, it's a little darker, the left hand side is a little brighter. So I just flipped the image horizontally so that the lights match. Now we need to create the shadows. First of all, let's select the cup, and we can easily do that with the object selection tool, and you can choose a rectangle or lasso, just make a selection around it, and Photoshop does a pretty good job. Now, doesn't do a great job of it. I would recommend using the pen tool, but to save time, I'm using the object selection tool. Now we want to subtract this area. Let's choose lasso, hold the Alt key or the Option key, and tell Photoshop, all right, this is not a part of the selection, and it does a good job. This is also not a part of the selection. Photoshop takes that away. This is also not a part of the selection. Now these we might have to do it manually. All right, good. Click on the mask button. Now there is no option but to create our own shadow here. So just above the background layer, create a brand new layer. And I would recommend creating these shadows in layers so that you have control over each zone. All right. Now while you're creating the shadows, as we discussed before, the shadow area that is closer to the subject would be the darkest. The shadow area which is further from the subject would be a little lighter, and it continues to be lighter and lighter. And if it's a soft shadow, a very soft shadow, in that case, before even completing the entire shadow, it just becomes so blurred that it just vanishes away. Anyway, so in this example, as you can see in the original image, the shadow is very soft, and before even completing that, it just blurs so much that it looks like it just vanished. So here we'll start with flow at 1% and start painting the shadows here, very close to the mug. We're not going to worry about areas that are further away. We're only going to paint very close to the mug, just so that it looks like it's on the ground. Now, if you don't want to get disturbed by the texture, you can also create a solid color adjustment layer and choose white so that it's very clear that way. Now, as you can see, we did a lot of mistakes because in texture, it's very hard to tell. So let's redo this again. Select all, delete. Okay, don't forget to deselect after that. Anyway, let's paint this area in black. Notice that I'm doing circular motions. If I did create straight lines here like this, then it will also create some ups and downs, some unevenness. Okay, so there's a technique to it. Create circular motions. If the shadow is getting inside it, that's fine. It's going to be covered anyway. You're just painting the shadows which are closer, which give us a feeling that this is attached to the ground. Okay, that does it actually. It does make us feel that it's attached to the ground. So this, my friend, is the first layer of shadow. So you can name it layer 1. Now let's go for the second layer of shadow. So we'll just try to go a little more outside in this case, just a little more. Now, as you can notice, the first layer is getting just too dark. Don't worry about it. We can control that later. If you have painted some area accidentally, you can hold the tilde key, the key on the left hand side of 1. It turns into eraser. The same brush turns into eraser with the same flow and the same values. And when you release the tilde key, it gets you back to the brush. Let's do the third layer right now. You can take all the time in the world to create the perfect shadow here. Doing a super quick job. A little bit shadow here also looks all right. Okay, so there you have your shadow. It's not looking perfect right now. Don't worry about it. There are some adjustments here which we need to do. Number 1 is definitely we need to control the opacity. We cannot completely take away a particular shadow. We have to control how much of it do we want. So I feel that about 70% of the first layer is what we want. For the second layer, you probably want a little less. Okay, 44. For the third layer, we probably want something like this. See that? As soon as we start adjusting the opacities, it begins to look okay. Now, opacity also might differ from background to background. So once you take that away, the opacities might be something different you want to keep. In this case, I want to increase number 2, probably, or number 3. It's up to you as to how you want to go about it. Now, after you're done painting the shadows, do not forget to also adjust the same with the subject as well. So on top of the subject layer, hold the Alt key or the Option key and click on the line between these two, and then just paint over the subject a little bit. You can also paint a little darkness in this area where the shadow just starts, because this is a different surface. Just by doing that, look how realistic it looks. Now, overall, you can create a group of all the shadow layers and just control how much of it do you want. I feel we need to keep it at about 80%, and there you have it. Now, on top of that, you can also add a curves adjustment layer and limit it just to the cup right there and adjust it accordingly as well. I feel that this will go a little darker, and this particular area needs to go a little darker. And let's make the shadows a little brighter. These little adjustments might help. Here's the before, here's the after. It's matching even more. Now, if the cup was of a different color, let's say red, the red would also fall onto the shadows a little bit. Let me share that example with you as well, because that's important. So let's say I create a solid color adjustment layer, red color, and then if I change it to multiply and hold the Alt key, the Option key, click on the line between these two layers. Now this cup is red. Let's give it a little lighter red, or give it a yellowish color. Okay. Now, if that was yellow, if that was red, we could have just used Blend If to take it away from the extreme bright areas to make it more realistic. So double click on the right hand side of the layer. Take the slider of the underlying layer from right to left. This is very harsh. So hold the Alt key, the Option key, click on the slider to break it apart. And you can do something like this and take it away from the extreme bright areas, so that they still retain the white. Okay, anyway, let's say this is yellow. Now the shadow doesn't look right, because the shadow needs to have a little bit of yellow to it as well. So to add a little yellow to the shadows, we need to create a gradient map. So this is the shadows group, before, after. Let's add a little yellow by creating a gradient map. And in this gradient map, we want to add the same yellow that we added here. So on the right hand side of the gradient, let's pick this yellow. It's not picking anything. Why? Because the mask is selected. Make sure the adjustment is selected. Then go here, single click on right here. For the right slider, let's choose this yellow. Make it a little brighter. And for the left one, we can go for the same yellow, a little darker section of that. Darker version of that. Okay, great. Hit OK. This is just a simple gradient. We only want to apply it to the shadows. Hold the Alt key, the Option key, and click on the line between these two layers. Now it's only on the shadows. Now we want the shadows to only darken, so change the blend mode of the shadow group to multiply. Still, it has that a little yellowish tone to it. You see that? So we need to decrease the opacity. We don't want it to be that yellow. A little bit yellow is all right. Maybe about 50%. There's a tint there. Here's the before, here's the after. See that? It will reflect some of its color. Anyway, with the shadows, let's increase its opacity back to 100, because I feel it needs to be a little darker, and that fixes everything. So for every background, the opacity is going to be different. For every color, you might have to make some little adjustments, but that is the gist of it. That is how you paint the shadows in some scenarios where you cannot, number one, extract the original shadow, and number two, use drop shadow. So here I feel I need to add a little more shadow on the left hand side. So let's go back in here. Let's go back to one of the layers, and maybe with flow at 1%, maybe I can add a little bit more here. You can just spend hours and hours with this. And in these cases, the skill actually is to learn when to stop, because there will be times where you just won't be satisfied and you might want to just keep doing. So we have to take that tendency away. Anyway, so those are 3 ways to create shadows in Photoshop. Number 1 is extracting the original shadows, and the way we do that is that when we bring a new subject to the background, we make 2 copies of it. With the second copy, which is below, we change its blend mode to multiply and also mask in the shadow. We use curves adjustment layer to remove anything that is extra and just keep only the shadows. We also use masks to manually remove the extras. And we also take away the colors in most cases if the colors of the original surface of the shadow is disturbing too much. That's basically the process of it. After that, you can use some compositing techniques to mix and match the subject with that of the background, but that's the basic fundamentals of it. The second one is just separating the drop shadow. In this case, you can also just make a selection of the subject and on a separate layer, fill that area with black and twist and turn the fill that you just made to create the shadow. Or you can create a drop shadow and just like we did, separate that by going to layer, layer style and create layer and use distort to shape it in whatever way you want according to the source of light. Also, do not forget, as the shadow area goes further and further away, it gets blurrier and blurrier and also lighter and lighter. Okay, so keep that in mind while you're creating that shadow. The third one is manually painting the shadow. In not all cases, you will have the privilege of having the shadows perfectly on a clean background so that you can extract it, or having the subject in such a position where you can just create a drop shadow and separate it and just move it in any way you want to create a realistic shadow. In some cases, you just have to paint the shadow where the shape or the position of the subject is a little complicated to use drop shadow or having a clean surface to extract the original. And the way to paint is painting layer by layer. On the first layer, you paint the shadow which is very close to the subject or the object. So you make sure that the area is dark enough so that the object looks as if it's touching the ground. Create a second layer and create a shadow for a little further away areas, so on and so forth. You can create 3 layers, 5 layers, as many layers as you please. The advantage here is that whenever you add a new background, you have the flexibility to control the opacities of each and every layer, and those will change according to the surface you have. Also, if the object is of color, don't be afraid to add a gradient map just to the shadows to add a little tint of that color. I hope the concepts of shadows are a little clearer now, and I hope that it's going to help you in your own composites. Please experiment, please play with it, please do practice, and I'll see you in the next one. Till then, stay tuned and make sure that you keep creating.